So the thing I hate is that like when the thing is counting down, like we don't talk to each other, and I don't know if it's because we can't hear each other, but it mutes our mics automatically. And I'm like, at least let us talk in the background. Like we could have had a perfectly good 30-second conversation, right then. But
I think we've proven the best conversations is the one where you wander into it as I'm saying something that makes no sense, even in context.
we've done that one a few times where we're like, what the huh? And that's always a fun one. The whole like, what is she talking about? But I love that there's I love that we always have this like, Amy is forever a wonder in a lot of ways. Like, you did what? Like, you cracked your tooth?
Yes, on the bottom. Like, I have to be very clear. It's not on the top. It's on the bottom. The part you cannot fix without taking it out. And it's horrible. And it makes your face blow up.
What did you do in a previous life that made the universe hate you so much?
Why am I
Were you a billionaire? Was that what you were? Were you a billionaire in a previous life?
Oh my God. Man, if I was, then I deserve it. Because the first things I think about is like, oh my God, I'd be a supervillain. You're right. I deserve it.
You absolutely would be. You'd be what do you call it? A kaiju like peddler? Is that what you call it? A kaiju?
No,
a kaiju peddler?
Yeah, like you sell.
Preservation Society. That's
no. I'm sure this person. You'd be a peddler of them.
I'm talking Wu Zetian like level of I would become.
I have no idea what those words you just said were.
She was a Chinese empress, and she was me.
Like an actual one, or is this
in ancient history?
Okay,
that's a real thing. Cool. The problem is I say real things at the same tone of voice that I say fake things. It's very hard to tell the difference, and I understand that.
Oh, so you're a politician in a former life?
See, I would have deserved it. I don't know what I would have done, but if I did anything, I would have deserved it.
All right. Hey, everybody! Welcome to the Cloud Economics Show.
Oh yeah, that's right. That's what this is about.
For sure. I'm Tim Banks. With me is Jesse DeRose and Amy Negretz. Everybody, hi everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
So we're coming you now. I know. Okay. We're coming to you today with the second in our series of talking about cloud economics. We still have Cloud Economics Show is still the name right now. If you have a better name, feel free to suggest it. I'm gonna sneeze here.
Bless.
So we did this DevOps documentary when I was at Dell, and there's probably maybe like a 5-minute or so supercut of nothing but me sneezing and pausing to sneeze and these things. And it's so great because I like my allergies. Once they get to me, they get to me.
I feel like that's
Chris, remember our old all my lights went away. But remember our old producer Chris from HumblePod, very nice guy, but probably has like just a terabyte worth of drops of me coughing and sneezing because it was when my allergies were real bad and I had no control over them.
Yeah. But my sneezing aside, we are here. We're 3 cloud economists, and we want to talk to you today about the topic of what is FinOps. And I'm sure you've heard it around enough times. If you've gone to a conference that has anything to do with cloud computing, there's been at least 4 or 5 vendors on the floor that are peddling FinOps. FinOps, and they all usually sell the same thing. But the thing is, just like DevOps, FinOps isn't like something you can just do with a tool. It is more than that. It's a whole thing, right? And we want to talk to you about that thing. So Jesse, I know you've got some strong opinions on what is and what isn't FinOps. Why don't you kick us off here with about kind of like where FinOps started?
Yeah. So the work of FinOps really started before the name. This comes from the migration to cloud, when tech companies, or even tech companies that weren't tech but had workloads running on computers in data centers, started moving their workloads into cloud service providers like AWS, GCP, Azure, God forbid, Oracle. And they suddenly lost all this visibility into how much they were spending on those workloads. Because in a data center, you have a very clear idea of like this fixed operational cost of like, you've bought a piece of hardware, you're running a bunch of stuff on that piece of hardware, the hardware depreciates over a certain amount of time, easy for finance to figure out. But on all these cloud service providers, the model was so radically different. It was focusing on seconds, minutes, hours of runtime costs rather than looking at depreciating a single cost over a long period of time. So all of a sudden, a workload that you previously knew or didn't have to care about the budget because it was running on a piece of hardware that you already had, financed ahead of time, suddenly that spend can skyrocket because you're spending way more money on that infrastructure running it in the cloud. Or maybe you've accidentally deployed the infrastructure twice and now you're costing twice as much running in the cloud. And there's not this clear visibility between what you're deploying and what you're actually spending until you start looking at what that spend actually is, until you start looking at your bill. And even then, when this started a number of years ago, the AWS bill, for example, is so obtuse and so difficult to read. So that's where this idea of FinOps came from. But it like spun out of this broader movement of work. And like, to me, at least, I feel like FinOps is like this umbrella term that speaks to a bunch of different other ideas of, cost optimization and cloud optimization and all these other different capabilities. So I feel like it really kind of groups together a bunch of different ideas and practices under this idea of trying to understand how much are you actually spending for these workloads in the cloud.
And I think to your point about its origins, it's important to note that, way back in the days of yore, before you had cloud hyperscalers that were doing OpEx, the FinOps portion of it was calculated at the get-go. When you requested a VM or when you requested hardware, right, there was a dollar sign. There was a little dollar amount attached to it, how it's going to be spent, who it's going to come from, how it's allocated, like budget and all these things like that, tagging for stuff like that. If you had network egress or ingress charges, those other do it. And there was an incredible amount of forecasting that you had to be able to do, right? Because every year or every quarter, whenever you got more money for more hardware, you had to figure out how it was going to be used. And so you were doing a lot of proactive work because you knew that, hey, all this thing has to fit into whatever we have right now for the next 3 to 6 months, right? Otherwise, we're not going to get any more access to anything. So there was a lot, you were resource constrained, and that was what you knew from the get-go. So when you were designing your application and when you were doing things for original infrastructure, right, you had to be cost aware because you got cost aware kind of by default, by de facto, I should say, because what you were being is you were resource aware. And I will, a thing I've said for a while now is that the cloud, hyperscaler has made us reckless in a lot of ways, especially in how we spend. The bills get way out of control, and there's not a lot of visibility into it, right? One of the main tenets of FinOps, right, is observability and awareness, right? And so many people had no idea what they were spending until the bill came.
And then it became a reactive process to figure out where did the spend go rather than a proactive process like you were describing you might have had if you were in a data center.
And I think it's so important to note, from where FinOps gets its name from DevOps, one of the things you wanted to solve was that something didn't get fixed until, we have the next sprint, we got to talk about this bug, et cetera, et cetera. Or ops is still, dealing with an outage or a constant outage or a near outage, constantly have to do firefighting until the next iteration of development cycle fixes the issue, right? And so the thing that was happening with FinOps is people were getting like, oh, wow, our bill went up $30,000. That's 3 people's salary, and things like that.
And you find that out at the end of the month. So then you spend another month figuring out what happened or where did that information come from and how can we do better. But then at that point, you've already got those development cycles planned out for the next couple of weeks to month for whatever product or feature releases or bug fixes or infrastructure work. So again, you're always kind of lagging behind the existing work that's in developers and operations hands.
And so I know, Amy, contrary to your youthful appearance, you have also been around this industry for a little while. How were you introduced to the kind of the concept of FinOps?
I look so nice. I got mistaken for like an under 25-year-old last weekend, and I didn't like that at all. It's very annoying. But yeah, so I think honestly, not even until I started getting into cloud migration, when I had taken my first migration firm gig, because before I came from either straight app dev, where back when the solution was to throw more hardware on it. So that was the hardware people's problem. It's nothing I did. And after that, it was public sector, which all of that budgetary work was done, but it was done before the project went out, not concurrently. So it was once I started getting into go into migrating on-prem stuff into cloud, or doing modernization on currently existing cloud apps and making them either service-based or serverless or whatever it was that they wanted at the time. And they're like, oh, you can't just use any service. This is the cheapest. This is the fastest. And I'm like, oh, that's a thing you actually have to know now. And everything made way more sense to me as I was started building stuff. Than if you don't actually have to think about it. You want to talk about the cloud making people reckless. It was that time where the idea of build fast and break things didn't have a third step where you had to fix anything, which people still aren't doing and is infuriating, and still saying that phrase out loud, unironically. And you can see that doesn't just show up in the way they design their applications, not just in how they design their infrastructure, but also they're also the ones who look at their bills like, I don't understand where any of this money is going, even though they've made absolutely no effort to tag any of their resources or build chargeback policies or cost centers or anything. So they don't actually know which app is costing anything, which team is costing anything. They have no idea.
And so I think it's interesting when we talk about that, especially when you don't have the lack of observability and lack of being able to really understand where the money is going and for what applications, is that, it took a long time to really champion governance in spinning up resources in the cloud, right? And a lot of people didn't do it well. There are a few that did, especially once you could start tagging resources. But even then, it wasn't great, right? And so I feel like, when we talk about the practice of FinOps, right? It has something. It has architectural considerations. It has observability considerations. It has what I call engineering effort versus administrative effort, which we can get into a little bit later. And all of these are stirred together into a pot, which basically is more culture and practice versus implementation detail. But I think the biggest thing that people shot themselves in the foot with was to spin up resources and deploy things that they only had, I think it belongs to this, because they'd have somebody's name, right? Or they would do the thing which has long plagued engineering org since. They tried to figure everything, where everything else out, where everything was, figure out where everything was based on the naming convention of the resource, which is a terrible way to do it, right? It was always a terrible way to do it. It remains a terrible way to do it. But people still do it. Like, the only arguments I've ever seen it, the only time I've ever seen screaming matches between engineers was over naming convention, right? But these are simple things that are just strategic. They're forethought. They are like, let me add some data to this so I know where it's going beforehand, and then make that a process, right? Go ahead.
This is where my love of like infrastructure as code and some of the DevOps mindset comes into play, because if you've got your workloads built and designed as infrastructure as code, yes, that requires getting to a point where you've already done the architecture. So this is a separate conversation from that. But once you've gotten to that point where you're actually deploying things, throw a couple tags on it in your infrastructure as code in your GitHub or whatever you're using, because then that means you'll do that work once to put some tags on it. And then every time you deploy that code, every time you deploy that infrastructure and those workloads, it'll automatically have those tags. So after the fact, you don't have to go looking and say, oh, well, this server that got spin up has Amy's name on it, so therefore it must be part of her team. And then Amy says, oh, no, I didn't spin that up. That actually belongs to this other team. So they have to take ownership. And then we have two teams who both won't take ownership over a resource. And you don't have any information because it's not tagged. So you have no idea where this computer came from or why it's being used anymore.
Yeah. So let's kind of go back. Let's walk it back a little bit and start over kind of with like, what is FinOps, right? The actual question is that I feel that, so FinOps, like we said, it's a practice, it's a culture, and which leads to, it's a culture and an ideology that leads to a set of practices, right? Just like DevOps is, right? But it is geared towards the financial impact of the decisions and the architecture you're making. And all the other things you would consider, like security, like resilience, like availability, like performance, all these other things like that. We can always make your bill zero, right? But you're going to give up a lot of stuff, right? And so I think that when you talk about like, how do you do FinOps, right? You do FinOps in a conference room or in a chat room or someplace where people are getting together and they're talking about things, right? And so you have these practices that add economics, the cloud economics and the financial impact of these things to requirements, just like you would have for, like I said, performance, reliability, resilience, all these other kinds of things like that, right? And the methods by which you will gauge success or failure, which, maybe success and failure are hard terms, but certainly gauge how well you're doing it versus where you need improvement, right? And I feel like FinOps, like we mentioned before, was far overlooked, and then you have to try and implement it after the fact. It becomes difficult sometimes. But when we talk about what are the pillars, you talk about architecture, right? We talk about observability and governance, right? And then we talk about engineering effort versus administrative effort, right? And let me, I detail those two out because they're two different things, right? Engineering effort is something I'm going to need to put hands on a keyboard to type to do, or a whiteboard, a re-architecture, or we're going to re-implement this, or we're going to change the way we do that, right? That's an engineering effort. It's going to take some time for some engineers to sit down and make a change to the infrastructure or to the application itself, right? An administrative effort means somebody just has to sign something or click something. Here's a great example, right? If I want to purchase savings plans, right? That's an administrative effort. I don't actually have to make an engineering change for that. Someone with the authorization just needs to go and sign a thing. A private pricing agreement is an administrative effort. Reserving instances, administrative effort, right? Those things are usually the easiest to do, right? And they do have can have quite a bit of impact, right? But the amount of impact they have, if those are the largest impact you have, then you've done a lot of things right and didn't realize it. However, right, most of the savings that I have seen realized in my work come from engineering efforts, right? And when we would sit down with with a customer, right? Even before we sat down with the customer, first thing we would get would be their AWS invoices and their bills, right? And once you know what you're looking for, you can pretty much guess not only their architecture but also their org chart and the arguments that folks had just by looking at the bills and looking at the invoices, right? Especially when you start looking at the tags. And so there's a lot of common mistakes that get made, a lot of common things that happen, right? When they make these decisions, when they kind of punt the financial impact of these things down the road as a we'll optimize that later, right?
One of my favorite phrases that we kept using was your AWS bill or your GCP bill, your Azure bill, your cloud bill is the culmination of all your business decisions. And that's not to say that it's good or bad. That's merely to say all of the business decisions you've made about your product and your workloads show in your cloud bill.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I think is very interesting about that is the work of doing FinOps, right? And cloud economics is 90% marriage counseling.
It really is.
And so it's interesting though, as you go through, is if I am saying, hey, I would like our organization to spend less, right? The first thing you have to do is examine the decisions you made that dictate your current spending, right? And you got to examine them objectively.
I remember there was a client that I worked with once who the people who brought us in was sort of the senior level technical leadership, and the client or one of their teams was spending lots of money, a large percentage of their bill every month, the sort of the overall organization's budget on this particular product. And they're like, we gotta get this team to optimize their spend. And the team just refused to optimize. So when we finally sat down with the team and asked what's going on, the team said, well, we've done the work to crunch the numbers, and we can show that it is actually more financially beneficial for the company for us to focus on feature releases for new features for this product that we have than to spend time on cost optimization work or other things. So once leadership knew that that's where this team was coming from, it was a completely different conversation, but they weren't talking to each other. They didn't know that information about each other.
Yeah. But I will add to that, oftentimes that when folks think, oh, well, if we do this work, we're actually not going to save that much. If you go back and actually look at a really in-depth way of where they can save money, there's usually a lot of savings we realize, but sometimes it takes someone, an impartial observer, to come and look at that. I think it's interesting though, because when we talk about bringing in the financial aspects to the engineering portion of code deployment, software development, infrastructure deployment, things like that, they don't know who they're talking to, right? Who's keeping the books? Who's keeping the numbers on this? Is it engineering management? Is it CFO? Is it finance org? Is it whoever, right? And so, first of all, that cultural aspect of sharing, that cultural aspect of interoperation and how everybody is important, right, in the org is the first thing you have to overcome, right? Because there's kind of this notion that folks are like, oh, well, what does finance know? Like, what do these people know about this? Well, finance is the one to make sure everyone gets paid first and foremost. Like, and that's the thing that a lot of folks don't think about. It's like, sales and finance, make sure everyone has a job and gets paid, right? And if they are kept out of the loop on a lot of stuff, now they got to play catch up. Right. The worst thing you can do for a company is give finance an unexpectedly large bill. Right. Because now they got to figure out where that money is going to come from. And so the biggest impact you can make for FinOps in your org is awareness, right? The biggest impact. The first thing you do is show the orgs, the development orgs, stuff like that, is how much they're spending. How much, without anything else. This is how much this costs, right?
Yep.
This is how much this application costs. This is how much your dev environment costs. This is how much these things cost, just as a metric, right? You don't even have to judge it. Just show me the metrics, right? Invariably, the kind of people that find themselves usually in this field are the ones where they want to improve that metrics. We're gamers, we're hackers. We want to make this a little bit better, a little bit. We don't, so if you just tell us like, hey, this is what your spend is on this. Okay, is that a good number or a bad number? Well, it could be better, right? Okay, cool. Well, how do we do that? Well, that's the question. How do we do that? But just that aspect of it, just getting the visibility, the observability, right, of the spend counts a long way. Even if you just show people the bill at the end of the month, is better than nothing, right? This is broken down by account. This is your group. This is this. Is something that really helps engineers out in part as part of this cultural transformation. Yeah, and so that's the thing too. Maya makes a good point. Even within the leadership orgs, like especially on startups and stuff like that, these people have never dealt with an AWS bill before, and so they don't know the breakdowns. They don't know the tagging. They don't think about these things as they're trying to do the MVP, and it is not directly related to the business of building software, right? Or building your application. And so it gets left as an afterthought. And then when it comes time to when you have to show investors like, hey, we need to tighten our budget, we need more runway. They're like, okay, what kind of cost optimization have you done? What? And so you have to incorporate this mentality, these ideals, right? As you build. And, we've talked about these, we've talked about some various things like that. About what we think the overall kind of FinOps cores and concepts are. Is there anything that I missed, Jesse, or Amy, you think that we should definitely be including in this?
I have a couple thoughts, but go ahead, Amy.
I think one of the biggest issues, especially when it comes to doing billing breakdowns and all this stuff, it's one thing to have metrics, but when you show, especially if you have either a young leadership who this is their first company, or these are a bunch of people who built a product together as a group, and it kind of spiraled out of control, or just anyone who either doesn't have that background or doesn't have a lot of experience in that background. If you show them a bunch of numbers, they get overwhelmed very quickly because they don't have the prerequisite understanding of, I don't know how much I'm spending, but I know what I want to spend it on, right? And this is what goes towards what I was saying last week, is like, it's one thing to say I want to cut costs, but if a majority of your cost is going to the product that makes the most money and you have really wide margins on it, maybe that's not the thing you have to consider. If you just want to save money to save money, that in itself is not a strong enough motivation. Because you're going to end up cutting something that's going to block a goal that you're going to have on another facet of your company.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So it's just having a basic understanding of how your business works and what it is you want your business to do. That with your initial run of metrics, that'll get you so much farther ahead than a lot of these young startups that go to these like VC meetups and stuff, where a lot of them don't have any of that. They don't have an understanding of what their architecture is. They don't, or they have a very vague idea of what their product is doing now, not how much it costs, not where they want to put further investment in it. And this is especially true if you are a if you are a smaller company looking for money, which a lot of people are right now, you have to be able to answer that question. It's like, if I give you money, where's that money going to go and what are you going to do with it? If you cannot answer that, short of I'm just trying to keep the lights on, they're not going to give you that money because you're going to spend it on keeping the lights on, which is important. But that also means it's like you're not going to be able to pay them back.
Yeah, and there's definitely, the notion of, to use the cliche, is the juice worth the squeeze. In this case, we will, when I presented things that a customer could do, we talk about like bang, I call it like bang for the buck. Literally, it's like, hey, if I do this thing, this easy thing, I'm going to save this much. If I do this easy thing, I'm going to save this much. I can do this thing and it will save a lot of money, but it's also a lot of effort. Or if you want to nitpick, like you don't want to spend $100,000 in engineering effort to save $3 a month, right? And I remember we had companies who will come in and we do a discovery and assessment. I'm like, y'all are actually doing really, really well. You can save some money here, but it's absolutely not worth it. There's no way I could, in good conscience, justify that you would do this. And that is a great problem to have, right? That's also rare. And I've seen other companies who, from the whiteboard, they architected a solution that was so cost optimized from the get-go that it's like, there's literally, not only is it not worth it, there's literally nothing you can do. This is brilliant. I love the way you thought about this, right? And then, you can do a little engineering stuff and not a little administrative effort, like reserve these things or whatever. But, it is a great place to be for you as an org, where the only effort you have to make is administrative effort, right? But going back to that notion of, let's think about the cost from the get-go, right? It could be something as simple as, can we optimize these workloads for ARM-based processors? Or can we optimize this for Spot? Or does this have to be run on GPUs? Or what is the cheapest store we can use? Like, there are some core principles around cost optimization that you can implement as part of your application development and whiteboarding, kind of as your requirements for when you do things. But again, if you don't have a culture that promotes that discussion as part of your requirements, then doing it after the fact is going to be very expensive, right? So it becomes the effort to do these things becomes more, and therefore the cost to make these changes becomes more the farther down the road you get.
Yeah, there's whole movement right now in the tech space about shifting left, shift everything left, shift security left, shift everything left. That is a separate conversation, but it comes back to this idea of FinOps starts at the whiteboard. FinOps starts when you are looking at architecting a workload, solving a problem. What are you architecting for? Or what are you optimizing for when you architect? Are you optimizing for availability, resiliency, cost, something else? And think about that as you're designing, and make that something that the developers, focus on. Create that culture that ultimately gives the developers the freedom to architect that the way that they best see fit. Because they're the ones who are the subject matter experts on this particular workload. They're the ones that we want to promote doing this work as much as possible. Not doing the work in the sense of like they have to do the work, but doing the work in the sense of like they're the experts here. Let's say this is how we want to ultimately solve this problem and get their opinion. And it's about creating that culture that's so important that I feel like a lot of companies don't do that. They do a lot of the governance of FinOps, and they do a lot of the sort of stick of telling teams what they're doing wrong. And then developers don't care about doing any of the optimization work unless they're absolutely forced to, because they're being forced to, because they're being punished essentially. Whereas if you give them this sort of carrot opportunity to say, hey, let's gamify this. Let's have an open conversation. Sky's the limit. No wrong answers here. What can you do? How would you build this? That makes it a much safer, more interesting conversation where they can really dive deep on what they know.
So I'm typing a flat out response to one of the chat things here. So let me ask you a question here. We've talked about we've hit some things about what FinOps is. What is FinOps not? What is it not?
not a product and it's not a SaaS. I'm sorry, but it's not.
Yeah. I was just thinking the same thing, Amy.
Yeah, I had to say it before you said it. And that isn't to say that there isn't value in the tools. There's extreme value in the tools that exist. For a group of people who claim to be super impressed about cost, a lot of people would come up to an engagement and say that cube cost is too expensive. And it's like, I don't know how you expect to measure this stuff otherwise. Did you bake your own? Nope. You're guessing then. You're guessing. The tools don't work if you don't use them. They also don't work if you don't know what they're supposed to be used for. They're meant to, that like every other tool is meant to support a process. The process should be, I know how to analyze what my spend is. I know what I'm looking for and I know where I'm going. The tool will not tell you that. AI can probably try to tell you that, but I don't. Just like you can't trust people who want to give you an opinion about how they think they look, the computer cannot tell you how much the computer is spending when it's on it. That you cannot trust that. Just kind of on the face of it. What you need to understand what your goals are. You need to be able to do that math on your own. So.
Yeah. I think, and this is where the thing is there, we have seen, like I said, a lot of tools that like, oh, we can do cost optimization for you. And it's just a matter of shuffling containers to different instances, right? Using AI or shutting things down automatically. And not to say that that's not important, but if that is how you realize most of your savings, you are, like I said, in a very, very good spot. But really understanding the impact of the architectural decisions you've made on the cost isn't something you're really going to be able to do. I feel like with an LLM or something like that, because as someone mentioned before, like it's not just the CPUs and the drives. You have things like network transfer, like inter-AZ stuff, extra, within a region with external region. Like, do you have a private pricing agreement, or do you need a private pricing agreement for some of these things? So like it's not always an easy answer, especially when you start factoring in resilience and performance and things like that. It becomes the set of variables while still holding in the importance of resilience and performance and availability is something that's kind of hard to really have a computer decide. Right now, can you have AI like read through your stuff and make suggestions? Sure, they've been doing that forever. Cloud Health, like I said, is a tool that VMware has now, or has had for a while, which makes some really good suggestions for purchasing reservations, moving around, turning stuff off. The AWS AWS cost optimization stuff in their well architected reviews and their trusted advisor has some of the more basic and rudimentary suggestions for sure, right? But it's not going to look at your bill. It's not going to look at this and say, okay, what can we do to reduce this inter-AZ transfer, right? How can we re-architect these things? What is important about this data? What does this data do? Why does it have to transfer back and forth, right? And those are things that you can only really discover through conversations, not just through observation. And to bring it back around, right? The nature of having that conversation is the nature of FinOps, just like having the conversation is the nature of DevOps.
I want to add to that. This may be a slightly hot take, but FinOps is not one person's job. FinOps is not like one specific person's title that you hire a quote unquote FinOps engineer and then you've solved FinOps. As we've been discussing, FinOps requires broad conversations and visibility across different departments within the organization. So there are individuals who can take on that work as possibly their predominant work or their primary work, but it's not just about putting one person on a team and saying we've done FinOps. They need to have sway with the teams that are, running workloads in cloud. They need to have authority to help make decisions. They need to be able to have visibility across different teams to understand who's spending what and how can we ultimately put all of this spend together in a place that helps not just a single team, but all the different teams within an organization see how much we're spending and understand how we can optimize and solve problems together.
Yeah, it is that sense of it's like when they say security is everybody's job, and yes, it is, but so is saving money, right? And I think the problem is that if you have a security problem, your customer is going to find out pretty quickly, right? If you have a performance problem, your customer is going to find out. If you have a resilience problem, your customer is going to find out, right? Who's going to know when you have a finance problem? Customer, maybe when they raise prices, right? Or shut down, or have to lay people off and then the service is degraded, right? But it is the indicators lag quite a bit. And I'm gonna shock you with this one, but the cloud hyperscalers are not really super invested in you spending less money. I mean, they offer some tips and tricks, stuff like that, but they want you to spend more. They're not going to be super thrilled with you spending less, and not that it depends on who you talk to out there too. Like your TAM's usually gonna be okay with it because then you're happy and they're happy. But some of the constraints you see, right, are there for their own profit, right? And you don't always have to be on a cloud hyperscaler. And those are the kinds of conversations you really need to have. It's like one of the things that Maya brought up is having a tool that could estimate your cost, whatever cloud you're on and stuff like that. The one place that you can still do that is in the data center, right? You know how much space something's going to take. You know how much network something's going to take. You have a vague idea of how much power it's going to take, right? Just buy the hardware once. You know how much everything is. And I will say this too, especially if you are in a place where you have sustainability and sustainability requirements by legislation or whatever, you're going to have a lot more observability into that as in the data center than you ever will in the cloud. And there is almost a direct link between sustainability and cost, right? Typically, if you do things that use less resources in general, it's going to cost you less. So you can, if you have to take, the leverage, right, to do a cultural affect, to do a cultural change, you have a couple of fronts you can do it on, right? I'm not saying that's the case everywhere, right? But there is a lot to be said about hey, if this is going to have less of an impact for us financially, it's probably also going to have less of an impact for us for some of our green initiatives. And there's been a number of work out there. Something that's probably we should cover another time too. Is the direct link between cost optimization and sustainability, because like I said, a lot of the fundamentals are the same. But when it comes to making the decisions about where to put something, right? That's something that you really want to consider, right? There's this notion of where you spend money. Like, are you throwing good money after bad, right? I've found that when we talk about administrative efforts, right? Can I reserve instances or something like that, right? There are very, very few cases under which you're going to be better off reserving instances than you're going to buy hardware, especially if you're looking at 3 years, right? If I'm going to reserve any number of instances for 3 years, I should just buy the hardware and put it somewhere else, right? Because you're going to save more. So what does that look like? If I'm going to be re-architecting for cost while maintaining performance, resilience, security, all those other things like that, with the world as my oyster, right? How much of this stuff do I buy to put a data center versus how much stuff do I put in a cloud hyperscaler? And to Maya's point, there isn't really a tool right now that can estimate that for you well. So you got to use smart people like us to give you some ballpark stuff. But that said, this is something that organizations can also figure out on their own. And it would behoove them going forward, as money becomes less free for some of these investors, hey, we can make these investments and go long term with it and save ourselves money going forward, and then do the due diligence and figure out what that's going to cost. The art of go ahead.
I will say this is one of the reasons why I'm hoping that the focus spend specification that we talked about last week actually takes off, so that we can see standardized spend between different clouds and have that, and allow organizations to have better visibility into how much does this workload cost in AWS? Can we move it to a data center to be more cost effective? Can we move it to GCP or wherever else to be more cost effective?
Yeah, because ideally I would love to have, if you're going to do a new project, right? Engineering gives finance the specs, right? And then finance goes and shops around for what's going to do it, right? I've got a contract here, I've got a contract there, I can buy this there, and blah, 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 right? Based on all these specs. That would be that ideally, that I would love for that. I would love for that to be the case, because you know you're going to get the best deal on whatever you're going to build, right? But who does that? I mean, that's a legit question. I haven't seen it before. I think that's an idea that works. So if someone out there has seen where that has worked, I would love to talk to you, right? But ideally, it's like, yeah, here's what we're going to need. You tell us how much it's going to cost, right? Anywhere, you know, and then we'll build for that. As long as the other requirements, as long as the rest of the requirements are met, why not? Let's see. Yes, you absolutely need to decouple code from infra. Code should code should really be infra agnostic, right? Which was that's what they said with Java. That's what they said with Docker. That's what they said with Kubernetes. You know, and that's always the hope, is I can literally just write it and deploy it anywhere. But there are a lot of options, a lot of things you can do. And I've seen customers who can deploy anything anywhere. You know, and ideally, if I could build something like for Spot, I can usually put it anywhere, right? But yeah, you are absolutely right. The code has to be agnostic. Your service deployment method has to be agnostic. You know, your network constraints, all these other things. The more agnostic you can make it, the cheaper you can run it. It's like if you can cook on a cast iron, you can cook on anything.
That's why Asians can make rice in any pot and in any place, even whether or not they should or not.
That's why I can make beans on anything, right? You know? I've literally caramelized onions on a steel plate before, so it's like. Jesse, do you have a like? I don't know, nothing.
I'm so sorry, I don't. I'm gonna have to work on that.
Yeah,
I can disappoint you with anything. How about that?
Yeah, you just did. You really just did. Yeah. No, and you are right. There is a sliding scale. There are some things that are definitely going to be better in a specific type of hardware, in a specific type of provider. But to the extent where you can make that the exception, the better, right?
Also, if you understand what your code needs and infra needs are ahead of time before choosing a cloud, heaven forbid you're actually allowed to know what that information is, then it is easier to get the cheapest type of cloud infra when you get to that step. The simplest way that I've seen choosing between 3 particular cloud providers is like, if you're already on Windows, you go with Azure. And if you're on Kubernetes, you go with Google, and everything else you like. There's one of 6,000 services on AWS, and they're getting more services every day.
I think it's I want to talk about how we did the practice of FinOps when I was at Elastic, because it was brilliant. Because FinOps, a lot of the FinOps engineering work fell in the SREs, right? So we would literally it would be your turn to do the bin packing, right? So you would go through, and everyone who was on a longer contract, right, or had long running things, you would bin pack them into a bunch of instances, right? And then we would go and reserve those instances. And then so we'd have a vast majority of our fleet was reserved, right? And then so we would on demand do stuff like that, and then bin pack into reserve. And so that became an automated process, right? But but the fact that we had designed our infrastructure and our container orchestration system and our processes to allow us to do this was critical in us being able to save money that way, right? Because if stuff can't move, right, or if it's hard for us to do that, like if there's a certain lack of resilience in being able to reschedule a node somewhere else, right, you're kind of stuck, right? And the thought thinking about this capability beforehand, right? Again, it's something that has to happen on the whiteboard, and then you can have the policies and procedures. So if when we say, hey, this is the thing we want to do, I'm going to be able to reserve the stuff I'm going to need for a while, or move it on to hardware that I own after a while. Okay, cool. What do we need to be able to do? How do we have to architect our application and our infrastructure and adopt our practices to allow us to do this with no effect on anything else, right? Have that thought, have that as a goal, have that as a requirement when you're designing these things, and it's going to open up a lot more opportunity for you later on down the road. That was it. That was the end of my story. So it didn't have any Kunjais. What was it? It didn't have any.
What?
Kaijus? What are the drugs? Kaijus. It didn't have any kaijus in it. But
I had to explain to Tim 5 seconds before this call what a kaiju is. That is why we keep bringing up kaijus. I apologize. A little bit. No, not really. I love them. They're great.
Never apologize for the things that you love to trash, Siren Amy.
I love big monsters. They're great. They're cute. They're horrifying, but cute. Like whales.
I love the Real Housewives franchise. You know, everyone's got their thing.
We just love different types of trash. It's okay.
So, I mean, we've got just a few minutes left, but I do really want to address, like, how do we start this? What is the genesis for, like, how I want to start FinOps, right? And literally, you just start by saying, hey, how much are we spending? Right? Ask the question. See the bills. Look at the bills, right? And then when you get an idea of that seems like a lot. Where is it going? All right. And then now that's your discovery, right? Now, we actually don't have this tagged. Well, let me start tagging these resources and these assets so I can get a better idea of what's going where, right? And that's usually the first things that I've seen successful companies with this transformation do, is to ask the question and start getting better data, right? As with pretty much anything else when it comes to computers, right? The practice of FinOps is always going to be data driven, right? And the data is going to be how much am I spending and on what and where. And then you have to kind of, like, as you go through, now you start ideating, oh man, so many of these resources got spun up without this, or this is just broken down by account, but not by this, blah, blah, blah. You start realizing a way to organize your things so you can do that. And then that's going to open up more things like that. So kind of a thing that was mentioned last week in especially in one of the talks for the FinOps X, there's no run. Everyone crawls, right? But you do progress. And so that notion of doing a little something is better than doing nothing really applies here, right? Even if you just tag everything well and have your accounts in your organization broken down well, or have all the spending from your and depreciation and repair costs from the hardware you own, right? And who belongs to what. That's way better than nothing. At least then you have enough data to make some decisions on, or to be able to report on, and then other people can make decisions on it, right? But that's where I would start. If you're new to it and anything else, get the data together, get the data correct, organize it, and get it broken down into places where you can really see everything.
You may also get a question from somebody above you asking, well, do we need to buy a tool? And the answer is, it depends. If you start
Jesse,
with
the principal engineer.
I've learned from the best, Tim and Amy. I've learned from the best. What can I say? But it really depends, because we've seen some of the best places to start is a spreadsheet. And now, granted, a spreadsheet's only going to get you so far, but a spreadsheet will absolutely get you some of that visibility to start with. And then, as Tim was saying, as you start asking more and more questions and you need more and more visibility across different places, maybe that's when you start thinking about a tool. Or if there's a tool that maybe your company already uses for visibility internally, like you have internal dashboards in a I don't know, a Tableau or a Grafana or something else. Like wherever you're porting metrics already, if you can start porting your cost metrics into that tool, start putting some dashboards together. But again, that's where you can start. Start with the things that you already have. You don't need to go out and buy a tool immediately.
Actually, a lot of these like I know Snowflake does this. I'm pretty sure Datadog does that. A lot of these have cost analysis things built into them already now. It isn't like when we were doing it 6,000 internet years ago, also known as like 5 years ago, where Excel is still the best place to start. But now we don't have to rebuild all of the basic information and just to unify all of the data. It's all within the tools already. AWS, when we had to hand build all of our dumb data sets, that all happens automatically now. It creates a bucket. It runs then analytics on that bucket without you having to port it to anything. Same thing with Google. Same thing with Azure. If you want to know what finance nerds are doing, look at Azure, because that's where Excel goes. So if someone's asking you to build a tool and you don't have a proper policy or program up yet, make sure you've actually exhausted the tools that you have already, so that you actually know what you're looking for. Because if you just buy a tool, that's a really expensive commitment for when you don't know what you're doing.
And I will say, chances are, if you're a large org, somebody already has a tool. Finance already has a tool, right? They have Tableau.
They also have Excel licenses there. You can just ask them for one.
They'll typically use Tableau because Excel will definitely run out of power after a while or something like that. But
yeah, sure.
But for sure, somebody has a license because somebody already wants to see graphs and charts of data of where all the money goes anyways, right? So this is just another thing to input. They also have somebody, if you don't know how to make pivot tables, they probably have somebody who's really good at that. I'm telling you right now that the biggest thing that I've ever done for FinOps, right, is a pivot table.
If you ever want to look at like a genius amongst engineers, learn how to make a pivot table. You'll look psychic.
Yeah. But the thing is that having that visualization of, wow, this is actually a lot, or this is how this changed, right, means a lot. Because what do you do is like, oh, wow, this changed. Well, what happened on this day? Because now that I can visualize it, what happened on this day? Oh, we deployed this. Well, let's go back and look at that code push. Like, ooh, right. We had it was literally a pivot table. I had a customer who went from this is the most egregious thing I've ever seen in my entire life. The customer spent $50,000 a month on what service do you think is the most thing? If I say $50,000 a month, what is the most outrageous service you think would be $50,000 a month in AWS?
One of the monitoring systems, like a CloudWatch or something.
Nope. No, that's reasonable. That's actually CloudWatch very expensive.
Oh,
Route 53. They spent $50,000 a month in Route 53.
How did you?
Because what they did was they deployed something that was making DNS calls, and it didn't have a back off, and it didn't have a sleep. So it was making DNS calls as fast as a CPU could possibly go. And this was coming from every system on which the code was deployed. Right. And so I was like, your Route 53 went up here. What happened then? And we went back and looked at the code. It's like, oh, why didn't you just put like a sleep?
My God, the problem was DNS all along.
Right? Why don't you just sleep? And it was and what was worse, it was Lambda, because the Lambda spike, because they're also doing an invocation every time.
Of course.
The only thing I don't know that fast enough to put that.
But little things like that, being able to see the date and time in which it went up and coordinate that with something else, and then go back and look at the code and figure out what this was doing, right? Is something that you will need a lot of insight into. And that is one of the most fun things that you do when you're doing cloud economics and FinOps, is like going back and doing the forensic investigation, because you have to know the code. You have to know the deployment. You have to know all these things, all that. And then when you can find the problem and then not get paid any more for it, it's great.
Reading the receipts is my favorite.
This is why I like to call myself.
I think I was very good at.
This is why I call myself, I use the phrase technical storyteller for a while. And Tim, I know you've used that one recently too. It's about being able to go back and read those receipts and understand, like follow the trail to see where did all this come from and how can we solve this problem and explain very clearly to a team or an organization, you want us to know why your spend went up. Here's all the information why. Here's all my sleuthing.
Yeah. And so this is just kind of a primer, this is kind of a start. The three of us are around. If you have questions about, hey, what is this? What is that? I want that. You can hit up any one of us. There are other folks out there that do this for various amounts of money. And some are specialized, some are not. Some can give you like that. And, there's a bunch of FinOps organizations. Again, I'm going to say something is better than nothing, right? But if you really want to see the best results, you have to have a holistic view of your financial posture, how you look at how you spend cloud finance, and you have to have good observability and good governance, right? And from there, I don't have anything else. We're about up at the hour. Jesse or Amy, Jesse, we'll roll out the red carpet for you. You got any questions or anything? You have anything you want to say last night? Anything you want to pitch to the
Someone
people?
suggested a title for this podcast. I suggested Friends in FinOps, so it spells out FAFO, and no one liked it. Please,
Hey, wait, whoa, what's up? We liked it, right? But we just didn't know if it was going to be right.
I think it's amazing.
A great title.
I think it's amazing for how this conversation tends to go.
Yeah.
The last thing that I'll say is, from all my experience, the one thing that I want to say, if you take away nothing else, if you don't listen to anything else that we say in this episode, FinOps requires both technical change and culture change. It's not just about the technical side of things. You have to be able to influence your culture in some ways. That requires a lot of different skills than a lot of the technical changes, and is definitely a different sort of set of problems. So keep in mind that it's not just about architecture or understanding whiteboarding. It's about aligning your people, your processes, and your tooling all together.
Thank you, Jesse. Amy, anything else?
Read your receipts, please. Everyone just read your receipts. Read your personal cloud receipts as if it was a corporate receipt. You want to talk about money you as a person are wasting on cloud projects? Look at that. I talk a lot. All of my stuff is technically tagged. All of those tags point to different things. It means absolutely nothing. It's bad. I have
physician heal thyself.
User accounts for when I was testing out Control Tower from 10 million years ago when we were launching it. It's a mess. I don't know how to fix any of it. It's bad. It's bad in there. Go check that. And Route 53, go clean up your Route 53. That probably looks bad too. You want to talk about stuff that looks bad.
My cloud hyperscaler bill is currently 0. One thing we're going to be digesting some of these episodes and putting them in a blog. I think Jesse has the first one posted on his blog, which we will link later another time. But look for some blog stuff like that. If you have stories, if you have questions, if you want to come on here basically to offer some content, let me know. I don't see why we can't have a guest. You just have to deal with us. So with that, thank you for watching the Cloud Economics Show. Title, which hopefully will change soon. Stay tuned. We'll be back here next Tuesday, hopefully, unless Amy gets tired of us both. And thanks for tuning in. And again, hit us up on the socials and let us know what you thought. All right, take care, everybody.
Mm-hmm.